In today's video, I'm going to show you how I take notes to learn languages. Hey there, my name is Witek, I'm 29 and I'm from Poland. I've been learning foreign languages since I can remember, and I now speak 6 of them. These include English and German, in which I have C2 certificates. The note-taking system that I'm about to show you is one that I've been using for at least the last few years. I remember instances of using it as early as 2017. I know that because I once stumbled upon my notes from when I started my job as a support agent with German and noticed that I was using more or less the same logic and structure. I was also happy to notice that I made enormous progress because the words that I had noted down seemed very basic to me later when I found this note. How did they even hire me? Maybe I used some form of this system earlier than that, but I wouldn't remember this. In any case, it has accompanied me for long enough for me to comfortably attribute at least parts of my language learning success to it. Let's go through some of the principles of my note-taking as it looks right now. I'll start with the hardware. Zapomniałem zeszytu. I have one physical notebook at any given time in the A4 format with about 100 sheets or so, although this one has only 70, which normally lasts for about a few months, maybe half a year. In theory, I like to use these notebooks for all other purposes too. In practice, though, they're mostly filled with my language notes. Then, every so many pages, there will be a page dedicated to something else. The proportions shifted now as I work more on this channel and sketch out video ideas and stuff. This, in fact, needs so much space that I moved my language notes to the other side of the notebook, something that I haven't done in years, but that's a minor technical detail. I dedicate one page to one language, and when I fill a page, I go over to the next empty page and it becomes my page for that language. Before that, I remember having just one giant stream of consciousness and I would note on the side which language I'm switching to, but I prefer the system with pages. Whenever I sit down to take notes, I enter the date on top of my entry for that day. I do this for fun, but it does help me realize how long I've been doing this for. And it also shows me that this habit sticks well, despite the fact that I take long breaks, weeks, sometimes months, between my note-taking sessions. This is what my note-taking session would look like in an ideal world. I would open my notebook, knowing that I'm about to consume some piece of content that will contain a lot of interesting vocabulary. For example, watch a YouTube video or listen to a podcast episode, most notably Inner French or RKL podcasts, or Damioz's YouTube videos. I would then note the words, ideally in full phrases. This is rarely what my routine actually looks like. For instance, I like to lay down to read a book, in which case I'm not going to get up every time I want to note something. I will just pull out my phone and write it in a new Google tab, of all places. Since I want to know its exact meaning, I will usually only type in this one word so that Google shows me its definition. This is less likely to make me write down phrases rather than single words, which isn't ideal, but an imperfect method that I actually use is better than a perfect method that I would never execute on. I also watch a lot of YouTube and podcasts while doing other things, in which case, again, I will just pull out my phone and jot down the word or phrase quickly in a new tab in Chrome when I encounter something worthwhile. I'm not going to write it down in my notebook right away, especially that admittedly, I like using my notebook with clean hands. This Chrome tab thing is ridiculous, I know. However, I haven't tried out many note-taking apps, but those that I have tried out, like Google Keep, Notion, Samsung Notes, whatever, I just didn't like. It's not as easy for me to open any of them as it is to open a new Chrome tab. So, in practice, most of the words that I end up writing down in my notebook spend an average of a week or two in form of open Chrome tabs on my phone. Again, in an ideal world, I would try to write down the words in phrases in which I encountered them, as opposed to single words without context. Our brains understand things in context, not in a vacuum. This is also more aspirational than my actual reality, because usually it's so much easier to write down a single word than it is to write a phrase. But I believe that writing down single words is still a net benefit, and that's why I keep doing it. It's just not as effective as writing down entire phrases. But some phrases would be so long that I would have to compress them somehow in order to write them down. And this is additional mental effort, especially if I'm taking notes while reading a book. it slows me down substantially. I also aim at not writing the translation of the given word. I used to do that in the past, maybe still 2 years ago, but I stopped after I watched Ali Abdaal's video about the learning practice of his friend who ranked #1 in medicine at Cambridge. In short, he wouldn't write what the definition of a medical term was. He would just make a list of the medical terms that he had to understand, and he would go through the list to see if he remembered them. If he didn't remember the meaning of a certain medical term, he would look it up and mark it with a corresponding color in his own list to remember to verify his knowledge again during his next study session. I'm trying to mimic this method as closely as I can in my context. Not writing translations teaches my brain to handle the word as it is. This tiny additional mental effort is what strengthens my knowledge of the language. And it also saves me note-taking time. Just knowing the translation at the time when I'm writing it down is enough for me. And then, if I happen to go through the notes, which I don't, and I don't remember what it means, I just look it up another time. But even if I never review this word, which again is the rule, just having written it down makes me more likely to remember it the next time I encounter it in real life. So, what types of words and phrases do I write down? This differs mostly based on the language. Since English is my strongest language already, and I also have the biggest obsession about improving it, I apply my most restrictive standards to my notes in this language. I'm happy to write down any words or phrases that I understand, but that I would unlikely be able to use. That is, words that are in my passive, but not in my active vocabulary. By paying this extra attention to the word, I make it more likely to bridge that gap. My German is not as strong as my English, because in no word would I be able to use it as much as English, unless I made it my top priority, which I will not. These months of idling in German bring me a massive imposter syndrome, which I'm trying to kill by also applying a very high standard to the words and phrases that I'm writing down. Spanish is my third strongest foreign language, and one that I have a way healthier approach towards, so I wouldn't be as strict with myself. I would certainly look up and write down words and phrases that are crucial to understanding the context and that I didn't understand, although this isn't as likely in the controlled contexts that I usually function in. If I notice that I understand the word in context, but I wouldn't be able to understand it if it was presented to me without context, then I will probably write it down too if it's in Spanish. What about my weaker languages, French, Russian, and Romanian? I would certainly write down the words that make me miss the context. Otherwise, I mainly focus on words and phrases that are slightly above my level and make the most sense to acquire next, and on words and phrases that will add the most to my ability to express myself in that language. All this is intuitive, really, and I bet I don't always obey to these rules of thumb. If I want to be generous and write more in my weaker languages, then I'll do it. If, in turn, I'm consuming content that involves a lot of difficult words, then I'll spare myself. A lot of that depends on the day, and throughout the years I learned to be better, though not perfect, at knowing when I can push myself and when I must stop. And, to be honest, taking my notes is quite often quite tiresome and extends into sessions longer than 60 or even 90 minutes. But I've learned to persevere and I don't burn out. That's the power of a habit that dates back to more than a decade ago. But at some point, even I have to stop. There is an infinite number of words and phrases that I could write down, especially in my weaker languages. I take a lot of notes. Sometimes 200 or 300 words a day can finish in my notebook, but that's just a fraction of what I could potentially note. Your limit might be different, and there are more things that go into managing this limit. Particularly in these weaker languages, it's important to not try and take too many notes. If you overwhelm yourself, you might find it harder to motivate yourself to your next study session. And no one intense study session will ever have a better impact on your progress than long-term consistency. If I take too many notes while reading a book, I might feel discouraged to read that same book the next day. As I said, over the years I've gotten better, but not perfect, at managing this. In the beginning, I would tell myself I wasn't allowed to take notes, when it appeared like the fear of taking too many notes will stop me from doing the activity in the first place. Now, it's more likely that I will just tell myself to take fewer notes, and it works just as well. And I do skip taking notes sometimes, but that's rare nowadays. If anything, if I don't note something down, it might be because the thought of doing so didn't even cross my mind. But when it does, I usually pull out my phone, open a new Chrome tab, and there you go. But I would absolutely allow myself to take fewer or no notes at all if I felt like I needed. As with any habit, this one too needs to start small. If you want to replicate what I do for yourself, then I recommend you start very small and see how far you can get without burning out, and then cap it at that. You will get much better results from the little notes that you take than from a lot of notes that you never take because you burned out. Now let's talk about where I take all these words and phrases from. My sources of input vary over time and equal out over the long run, just as much as the proportions between specific languages do. In English, my most recent notes come from a book that I'm reading in physical copy right now, The History of New Zealand by Michael King. It's written for natives about history by an erudite who strives to sound fancy and sophisticated. So there is an overwhelming abundance of words and phrases that I could note down and that I do write down. But I have to limit myself, otherwise I would just rewrite half of his book. But other books too have more sophisticated vocab than any other content source. At the same time, I'm reading The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb on Kindle, but I'm only highlighting words as I read. When I highlight a word on Kindle, the definition gets presented to me automatically, and I don't feel compelled to write it down elsewhere, so they'll just stay there as highlights, I think. But only as recently as 5 months ago, I would also note down words encountered while reading on Kindle. So looks like this has changed a bit for me, but it's a detail. Again, since books use more complicated vocab, they account for a lot of my notes when I'm reading them, particularly in physical form, but then for almost none when I take a break from reading. Another side note is that I learned that I stay way more focused when I read and listen at the same time, so I'm simultaneously listening to both of these books on Audible. Every now and again, I stumble upon interesting words in the massive amount of YouTube content that I consume in the language of Shakespeare. So these words end up in my notes too. Sometimes I encounter interesting words in public when I'm in a country that uses the language, which will also end up as Chrome tabs until I transfer them into my notebook. And finally, I jot down words used by native speakers, either in speech or in writing. In German, most of my notes come from the few pieces of content that I consume every single week, i.e., episodes of the Marktgeflüster podcast and videos by Niklas Steenfat. In Spanish, they come from my Italki classes and from YouTube videos of RQL. I'm about to start over the book La Sombra del Viento, this time accompanied by an audiobook. But this book is so complicated that I understand just enough vocab, probably around half, to keep a vague idea of the context, and I'm definitely not going to make notes. In fact, I might not even highlight too much on Kindle, because I would have to highlight at least half. In French, my notes come from the episodes of the Inner French podcast, and recently, YouTube videos by Guillaume Mubesh. 2 years ago, many of them also came from Italki classes. In Russian, they come from my Italki classes and from videos on Damioz's YouTube channel. In Romanian, they come almost exclusively from my Italki classes from between 2022 and 2024. So far, I haven't found any suitable source of input for intermediate learners, nor easy enough content for natives that I would enjoy. Maybe I just haven't searched hard enough, but there seems to be a gap in the market. I tried to force my lovely Romanian wife into starting a podcast like that, but she's just not into that. If anyone out there wants to produce a Romanian podcast for intermediate learners, I promise I'll listen to it. And I'll even buy your products, just like I do with all the other podcasts that I listen to. Anyway, in most cases, the italki tutors do help by noting down the words I wanted to use but didn't know, or the phrases I used incorrectly. These notes are either typed directly into the chat or saved in a separate document. When they're shared through the chat, I later rewrite them into my notebook for Spanish, Romanian, and Russian. However, when they're in a separate doc, as for example my most recent French tutor does, I somehow don't feel tempted to go back to them and I don't rewrite them. In case of Romanian or Russian, it's been quite a long time since I took my last notes. But one day I will make my notes in these languages great again. And soon enough, other languages will be added to the mix. I might already have one page in Italian in my old notebook. Now, let me tell you what I don't note down. I don't note down stuff from songs, at least not yet. Sometimes I listen to American rap songs and I notice that I don't understand what's going on. So this would be fun to analyze and note down one day. I also don't take too many notes at the beginner level. That also means that I don't take notes from the Babbel app. The Babbel app is a nice little hermetic environment, and it's already got its own spaced repetition system built in. So to me, doing that would feel sort of counterproductive. But even outside of Babbel, basic words are used frequently enough that you will memorize them through consistent practice alone. They will provide more than enough inputs for spaced repetition to kick in naturally. At the advanced level, you can increase your exposure to rare words and memorize more of them faster by taking notes, which makes a difference for your rate of progress. I start taking notes at around lower intermediate levels to accelerate memorization. But since I'm typically not in a rush with learning, this still technically wouldn't be necessary. I just enjoy doing that. I've already done all Italian courses and classes in the Babbel app and even started watching a few YouTube videos, but so far I barely have any notes. I did, however, take notes in French when starting in 2020, maybe because I was learning from YouTube, and that alone wouldn't have been enough to remember the basics, I think. I would do this differently now. I would do the Babbel app and not take any notes. I also took notes in Romanian and Indonesian for the same reasons. I was using Romanian Pod 101 and Indonesian Pod 101 in 2021, and I was taking notes because I felt like I had to supplement these resources. I even created an entire transcript of a YouTube micro-series for beginners in Romanian, and then I highlighted the out of it. But again, I didn't take notes in Indonesian while on the Babbel app. Unfortunately, Indonesian on Babbel kind of sucks. It ends very quickly at A1 and then you forget the basics, so I need another resource. As I'm making this video, my wife and I are traveling full-time, and I'll now tell you how that affects the way that I take notes. When my wife and I quit our corporate jobs in Luxembourg in July 2024, we decided to travel the world on small backpacks. Our first one-way ticket out of home was in early November, and I only took a 30-liter backpack with me. Space was very valuable, so I didn't take my notebook with me. It's the 30th of June of the next year now, and I'm still traveling the world on it, except that we got some jackets for New Zealand winter. I also wasn't going to take too many notes while traveling, but every now and then we have some downtime during our trips, and I do end up wanting to jot down a word or two. Now that I travel, I replaced the handwritten notes with Word documents. Whenever I encounter a word that I want to write down in any of the previously described contexts, I open a new Chrome tab on my phone and put the word in there. Up until last week, all my words would have to get through my backlog of hundreds of open Chrome tabs and patiently wait for that one time in a few months that I would do them the favor of transferring them to my notes. Then, every several weeks, I would go through my Chrome tabs, write down these words, and close the tab. If I forgot the meaning of a given word, I would look it up again. I would try to remind myself where I encountered this word. If only a few days have passed since I added this word to my phone, I usually remember the context in which I encountered it. It's more difficult than that if I'm rewriting my notes several weeks later. And I do take notes less often while traveling, obviously. I kept the habit of putting the date on top of each entry. That's fun. Only sometimes do I listen to Inner French episodes with the transcript open and I copy the entire phrases right away. This is not ideal because handwritten notes are proven to stimulate your brain better, apparently, but it still makes me pay attention to the word once more, so that's a win. I'm not going to rewrite these words to a physical notebook once I'm back. I'll just resume where I left. In fact, as we are now staying for 5 weeks in one place in New Zealand, I bought this new notebook, but I only had one note-taking session so far with the book about the history of New Zealand, but the session overwhelmed me because I was trying to note down too much. That doesn't seem like a lot of notes, maybe, but all of that comes from 2 to 3 pages from the book. As you can hear, it still happens to me sometimes. But as I've said before, I've gotten better at identifying and eliminating such obstacles. So the next time I proceeded to read, I didn't expect myself to take notes, but I still ended up taking them in the form of Chrome tabs. In fact, I now have about 300 Chrome tabs open, with words that I noted down that require rewriting. I even took screenshots of the transcription of the Inner French podcast recently, for the first time ever, because I was walking the dog and I just couldn't be bothered to stop the podcast and write down the word in a new tab every time. But I still really wanted to go back to these words later. The next time I have a note-taking session, I will document it for YouTube and I will upload it as my next video. As mentioned, I've already noted down words in form of Chrome tabs before this trip, but now almost all of my vocabulary goes through this purgatory. Let's finish this by mentioning the biggest weakness of my note-taking routine. I don't have a review system. I almost never go back to my notes. Does that mean that I'm missing out on memorizing more vocabulary? Maybe, but I still managed to pass C2 exams in English and German doing just that. And I'm also planning to prepare for my future C2 exams like that. That is, to make progress this way until I reach a level where I feel like I can attempt to take the test. However, my goal for some languages doesn't stop at C2. It's to become an absolute beast. In English, ideally, permanently. In other languages, German, French, Spanish, Romanian, at least in some peak moments, maybe not all the time. And if I want to become this savage, then I should probably look into introducing a review system for my notes. However, as of now, I just can't be bothered to go back to words and phrases from the past. My idea is to one day supply ChatGPT with my notes and have it test me, or create input using these words and phrases. I mean, creating output that would then become input for me. Maybe one day I could even build my own software or vibe code my way through that process to supply AI with words and phrases that I noted down, for it to then create lessons and review sessions in a structured but most importantly engaging way. At some point in the future, AI will probably be able to build entire courses off of notes just like that. But as of now, nothing beats long hours of exposure to the language every single day. That's probably how I've been able to make progress despite lacking review sessions. Even though progress is extremely hard to see once you're already at C2, and even though my passive vocab is still smaller than my active vocab, just like everybody else's in any language, I can now use words and phrases in many sentences that make me sound like a pro in English. And my note-taking system still has some elements of SRS to it after all. As mentioned, I often note the word on my phone when my notebook isn't around, and then I rewrite it a few days or sometimes a few weeks later. This is usually far from the ideal intervals in the spaced repetition system theory. I only sometimes respect the first one-day interval when rewriting my notes from italki classes, but that's just a small percentage, and it's been a while since my last italki class. But it still has some effect. Also, you are more likely to use words that you have noted recently in your next conversation, thereby also doing spaced repetition. In The Black Swan that I'm reading as we speak, the author quoted some research showing how people are more likely to use words and phrases that they used in the past. I remember this was the case with me in my German-speaking customer support team between 2017 and 2018. I would note down a word or phrase that I encountered in a message from a customer, and then I would find myself subconsciously trying to use it in my next conversation, in a matching context, of course, between me and the team. My system also has other flaws that I mentioned at other points. Even if I know that writing down phrases rather than single words is more beneficial, most of the time I jot down single words, and if it's a phrase, I usually keep it shorter than optimal. That's also something that I would like to look into in the future, but I already noticed that starting this YouTube channel about language learning motivates me to improve my own learning process, where I know it can be improved. So I'll probably note down more complete phrases from now on, and I've already tried and do that here. These are phrases. Can you see that? Sick. Now, that has been quite a brain dump. But if you want more tips from me regarding language learning, then subscribe to my newsletter through the link in the description. Otherwise, go watch this video next to accompany me during my next note-taking session. Since I don't want to keep 300 tabs open in my Chrome, I'm going to go through them shortly and I will somehow document it for this YouTube channel. I'll go over the dozens of words and phrases that I noted down in each of my languages. I'll explain how these words drew my attention, what the context was, etc. So if you liked this video, then you will like this video even more. Go watch it, I'll see you there.